Guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Ich begrüße Sie zur 4. Veranstaltung unserer Mosse-Lectures in diesem Semester. Heute mit Colm Toibin und Tobias Döring. Sie wissen, unser Thema für das ganze Semester ist das der literarischen und künstlerischen Nachbarschaften, den Beziehungen, Affinitäten, Obsessionen im Verhältnis zum Schreiben von Autoren, zum Schreiben anderer Autoren. Schreiber sind zuallererst Leser, wenn sie anfangen zu schreiben, hat John Coetzee umstandslos gesagt. Und so hat uns, wenn Sie schon dabei waren, Reinhard Jirgel am Anfang unserer Reihe gezeigt, wie er seine Dublin-Lektüre eigentlich nie wieder losgeworden ist. Er hat mir gesagt, durch die Anregung der Mosse-Lectures hat er ein halbes Jahr nur Dublin gelesen und hat jetzt Probleme davon, wieder wegzukommen. Also auch man bleibt Leser, wenn man schreibt. Eine Erzählung vom Schneesturm, wie in Wladimir Sorokins Roman, gibt es schon ein Dutzend Mal in der russischen Literatur des 19. Jahrhunderts. Diese Erzählung, die dann ankommt, eben bei Sorokin, bei diesem Autor, ankommt und historisch wird, utopisch, politisch in unserer Gegenwart. Und Brigitte Kronauer, wenn Sie sich erinnern, hat uns von ihren Neigungen und Abneigungen beim eigenen Schreiben berichtet. Und dann, als wir hinterher beim Abendessen saßen, fragte sie, lest ihr dann noch voll Fontane? Mögt ihr in Berlin noch Fontane? Was ich ihr natürlich vollmundig bestätigt habe. Ich rede kurz und mir die Ankündigung. I just make it short in German and then Thomas takes over, okay? Just connect a little bit. Ich muss leider, es ist schon einmal gesagt worden, mitteilen, dass die nächste Mosse-Lecture mit Seruja Shalev aus Jerusalem und Aleida Assmann leider ausfallen muss, wegen eines Trauerfalls bei Seruja. Das war für den 15. Januar geplant. Aber wir freuen uns sehr, dass wir Lutz Seiler gewonnen haben für eine Mosse-Lecture, dessen Hiddensee-Roman Crusoe ja in aller Munde ist. Und er kommt in die Mosse-Lectures, wenn Sie sich das notieren wollen, am 29. Januar. Und er hat für sein Thema, er hält einen richtigen Vortrag, als Thema angegeben, seine Favorites, seine literarischen Nachbarschaften, Georg Trakl, Stefan George und Pink Floyd. Begleitet von Lothar Müller, der uns auch schon mit unserer Veranstaltung zu Jirgel begleitet hat. Also Sie sind herzlich eingeladen. Dank sagen möchte ich zum wiederholten Male unseren Financiers, unseren rührigen Financiers, das ist die Fritz-Thyssen-Stiftung, die Mosse Foundation in New York, der Präsident der Humboldt-Universität und das veranstaltende Institut für deutsche Literatur. Nun, dass wir Colm Toibin heute gewonnen haben, das freut mich ganz besonders. Ich habe ihn nämlich auch gelesen. Also diesen so prägnanten, fantastisch schreibenden und lesenden Autor aus Irland, aber nicht nur aus Irland, sondern auch aus New York, der auf ganz eigene Weise James Joyce und Henry James die Treue hält, unter anderem. I translate this for you later. Tobias Döring wird ihn gleich vorstellen und im Anschluss werden die beiden dann dort ein Gespräch führen und je nachdem, wie intensiv das wird, wie lange das dauert, sind Sie auch herzlich eingeladen, dann daran teilzunehmen. Es ist gut, finde ich, dass Tobias Döring wieder einmal da ist. Er ist uns nämlich seinerzeit entkommen. Er ist von der FU, wo er promoviert hat und habilitiert hat, ist er nach München gegangen. Ich kann nur das Wichtigste aus seinen Publikationen und von seinen zahlreichen Funktionen hervorheben. Tobias Döring hat sich wie kein anderer um die Literatur anderer Länder und Kulturen gekümmert, vor allem die afrikanische, die karibische. Hierzu ist zuvor sehr viel mehr, aber 2008 sein Buch Postcolonial Literature in English erschienen. Sein zweites großes Arbeitsgebiet ist, wie könnte es anders sein, Shakespeare. 2006 hat er seine Monographie Performances of Mourning in Shakespearean Theatre and Early Modern Culture veröffentlicht. Und von 2011 bis 2014 war Döring der Präsident der Deutschen Shakespeare-Gesellschaft. Auf vielen Konferenzen und Podien ist er ein wichtiger Kommunikator und Vermittler zwischen den Sprachen und Kulturen. Und in Deutschland ist Tobias Döring darüber hinaus, viele von Ihnen werden es wissen, durch seine sehr, sehr zahlreichen Rezensionen in der FAZ seit Jahren unser wichtigster Informant, was die angelsächsische Literatur angeht, auch zu Autoren, die vielleicht heute Abend eine Rolle spielen, also Edith Wharton, Henry James, James Joyce zum Beispiel. Ja, ich begrüße Sie beide sehr herzlich, Tobias Döring und Colm Toibin. Thomas.
Vielen Dank, Klaus Scherpe, und herzlich willkommen, guten Abend auch von mir. Imagine the following situation. A country house in rural Ireland in the 1960s, not too far from town, but off the road in a remote place where you can just hear the cows and perhaps a distant tractor. A woman, middle-aged and a mother of 4, has come here to visit her aunt without announcement or arrangement, indeed without premeditation. On an impulse, it seems, she decided to speak to her aunt, but what exactly she wants to tell her is not quite clear, apparently not even to herself. This woman is in mourning, a widow. Her husband died and left the family to fend for themselves, 2 grown-up girls and 2 young boys. In the months that her husband lay dying, these boys stayed with their mother's aunt in this place that she's now visiting, as if she was trying to find out what exactly happened there during that trying time, because both boys returned to her somewhat disturbed, the older with a stammer, the younger wetting his bed. So she's wondering, should she rather have not given them away? As she approaches, she finds the house empty, though with lots of living traces, an unmade bed, books on the floor, newspapers lying around. It is a modern place attached to an old farmhouse and converted for convenience in old age, but her aunt is not yet old. In fact, she's still very active, gardening and enjoying it. So while the widowed mother is walking around the place, looking at the garden, she keeps wondering what exactly her boys must have gone through in the months they spent here. And suddenly, she realizes, the place is not empty after all. She is not alone. Her aunt is present and has been observing her in silence for some time, as if to find out what she herself was trying to find out in coming here. The conversation that ensues is somewhat strained. They go through the motions of having a friendly cup of tea and talking family affairs, but without really addressing the issues and without managing to find appropriate words for the necessary questions. So the silences and gaps in their talk may be just as relevant as what is actually being said. Eventually, Nora leaves, and her aunt says, "I'll drop in again someday when I'm in town." Is this a promise? Or perhaps a threat? Now, what I've been telling here is a scene from Nora Webster, Colm Toibin's most recent novel, early on the 2nd chapter. It's his 8th novel, published a couple of months ago to very great critical acclaim. The LA Times invoked Tolstoy to characterize the story of a shaken family trying to cope with unhappiness. And the New York Times found in it the Joycean spirit of the dead, with the living haunted by some ghosts from their distant past. But to me, the really powerful issue, the really powerful point about this novel is rather that it does not need a dramatic plot, no stories of adultery, no suicide, nor any revelations about lovers or dark secrets in the past, and yet it works. It is an epic of the everyday, centering on one woman's effort to rebuild her life in middle age despite bereavement, strife, trouble, both at home and in the wider world of Irish politics, to which the novel at many points alludes without ever putting it center stage. We are in the late 1960s, after all, the time when Ireland moved into the period known as the Troubles. Throughout, the narrative is resolutely focused on the widowed mother, placing us as readers into the very position of her aunt, that is, making us witness her endeavors, patiently observing her and wondering what it is that she may be seeking. From this perspective of an empathetic though distanced observation, many details of this novel gain relevance and resonance. For instance, the particular construction of her aunt's house, joining a modern place to an existing old structure. An image perhaps of the combination between the old and the new that is characteristic also for so much of Toibin's own writing, where the past and the present, the literary tradition and contemporary creation coexist not just side by side, but in mutual support, in active dialogue and continuous questioning. Equally resonant is the main setting, a small town in County Wexford, topography that is significant both in national terms of Irish history and in personal terms of Toibin's own. He was in fact born and raised in this particular place in the southeast of Ireland, and he has returned to it in quite a number actually of his books, of his novels. This is the reason also why many readers saw in Nora Webster now some convergences between the story that is told here and the author's own early family life, and especially the fact of the early death of his own father has often been pointed out. But such autobiographical readings, I think, fascinating though may appear, rather miss the point of what, according to Toibin's own account at any rate, a novel truly is and actually does. Writing about Henry James, one of his greatest literary neighbors, to invoke the title of this Mosse series, or perhaps you could say one of his greatest literary sparring partners, writing about James, Toibin once explained that, quote, "This is all a novelist needs. Nothing exact or precise, no character to be based on an actual person, but a configuration, something distant that can be mulled over, guessed at, dreamed about, imagined, a set of shadowy relations that the writer can begin to put substance on," unquote. So it is the constellation, the relationship, we should rather focus on when reading Nora Webster, noting, for instance, the special and especially strained relationship between the title character, this woman called Nora, and her aunt, the country houses of whose he's visiting, the aunt functioning both as a figure of authority to be relied on and perhaps as an autocrat to be resisted, possibly rejected. As a matter of fact, the aunt is a key figure by which this novel engages in a dialogue with a great tradition of 19th and 20th century fiction, whose interest in dysfunctional, disturbed or broken families Toibin has analyzed with great wit and ingenuity in a celebrated essay focusing on aunts. Quote, "Thus aunts depart in novels as aunts arrive, to break the peace and lighten the load. He writes in this article, which was first published in the London Review of Books, and later became the opening piece of his essay collection, New Ways to Kill Your Mother. It's a great book, but not recommended as a family gift for Christmas. His main examples in this essay on aunts, his main examples are Jane Austen and again Henry James. But the point he makes about the classic family plot here has wider relevance. Another quote, "Mothers get in the way of fiction. They take up the space that is better filled by indecision, by hope, by the slow growth of personality. The novel is a ripe form for orphans," unquote. And just a glance, just at the spectrum of 18th to 20th century writing will confirm us, orphan indeed figures very prominently in this tradition, making the novel a form by which to explore predicaments of self-invention, self-affiliation, or self-fashioning against the loss of stable structures and of given genealogies. Orphans in this sense are tropes of uncertain belonging, hence also of potential freedom, especially interesting and challenging perhaps for a tradition of Irish writing where dominant mother figures abound, Mother Island for one, or indeed Mother Church for another, and where history has been called the nightmare from which we are trying to awake. In the light then of Toibin's Mother Critique, which was first published in 2011, it seems highly remarkable that the two novels he has published since both in fact focus on mothers in mourning, whose voice and fate are given center stage. Prior to Nora Webster, he published The Testament of Mary, a short but wonderfully intricate and very densely written, very moving novel, produced also as a stage play, which was performed on Broadway by Fiona Shaw and also recorded as an audiobook by Meryl Steep. And it presents, as it were, to us the ultimate mother, the Virgin Mary, who is giving us here in her own voice, in her own words, as it were, her account of the events that made world history. A view, of course, that is completely left out of the Gospels. It's a daring project, as you realize, because the fictional dialogue that is risked here is with no less a neighbor than the Christian Bible, suggesting that fiction is precisely this, an exploratory space for us to imagine what may and what may not have happened. So, for Colm Toibin then, literary neighborhoods are no comfort zones, but contact zones in the sense described perhaps by Mary-Louise Pratt as areas where different voices meet, clash, and grapple. A major theme, however, in the novel Nora Webster, the most recent one, is not just a literary neighborhood, but also the neighboring relationship to another aesthetic art form, to the art of music, especially to singing, and especially to German vocal music, which features very prominently there, as Schubert, Beethoven, Brahms, an art by which the central figure manages eventually to cope with grief and to regain a new voice of her own. And it's to this aspect, the relevance of music as, well, the unspeakable in fiction, but the nevertheless present and workable in fiction, and its relevance for modern fiction, that Colm Toibin is going to turn in a moment in his lecture. Toibin has long been recognized as one of the foremost contemporary writers, recipient of many literary prizes and translated into 30 languages. After several years in journalism, he published his first novel in 1990. To date, he has published 8 novels, and you find quite a few of them actually on the book table outside. I'm happy to announce 2 volumes of short stories, 2 volumes of essays, various travel books, critical studies, as well as edited collections, and countless articles, many of them as a regular contributor to the London Review of Books or the New York Review of Books. He teaches in New York at Columbia University. He lives in Barcelona and Dublin. He travels a great deal and is continuously writing, so we're extremely happy that tonight he's made it en route from Zagreb, I understand, right here to Berlin to speak to us about the silence between music and fiction. Colm Toibin, we're looking forward to a lecture.
Thank you very much. It's funny listening to someone talking about you. It's like being dead. And it's also even better because everything said is more or less true, which is new to me. Normally, everything is always wrong. Part of the reason why, or perhaps the only reason why I'm interested in these subjects is they have begun to preoccupy me as a novelist as to what you can and cannot do in the novel now. The very difficult business of trying to introduce a miracle into a novel. And it arose, and perhaps we can talk about this later, when I came to the end of the novel Nora Webster, and I wanted to do something, and I wasn't sure I could, because the novel is such a secular space. It's so filled with material things that the idea of bringing God into a novel, or a miracle, or the dead, or letting someone from outside the actual touchable, palpable world into a novel is difficult. And so too, invoking music in a novel is very difficult. It's dangerous. Novelists who do it tend to do it very badly. They use metaphor and simile. They're always describing music really badly. And you read the musical section, you think, this is really bad writing. I wish they'd leave music to, let the violin play the music and you write your sentences. How do you write about music in fiction? Because, of course, you write in silence. The reader reads in silence. You can't press a button. It's not like a movie. In a movie, you can press a button and music comes up and you know how to feel. When you're writing a novel or reading one, how you feel depends on the silence between, on the white spaces in the page as much as the black ones. So when, again, writing Nora Webster, it began to preoccupy me as to if you have a character who whose only way out of her ordeal is to learn how to sing. How do you describe her singing? How do you describe the playing of a piano and the learning of a song? What sort of tone must you use for that? And if you do invoke music, and if you do manage to invoke it successfully, what will that do to a book as you're working on the book? So what I'm talking about here first are issues that have preoccupied me in the writing of the Testament of Mary, especially when I came to the subject not of the crucifixion, which I found could be described in physical terms, merely by describing what was done, what was said, what was seen, but the much more difficult one to write, which is the story of Lazarus, which is, how do you describe a miracle in a novel? Do you expect the reader to believe the story? If so, how? The reader now, for the last few hundred years, has been skeptical, especially in a novel. So anyway, these things preoccupy me, and I thought maybe I should read, go back and look at books, try and formulate some way of dealing with this issue of letting the transcendental or the outside or the numinous or the strange, music, religion, God, miracles, into the space that's been so carefully guarded against them by so many novelists who are interested in money, inheritance, love, adultery. And in a very odd way, but in a very perhaps human way, good and evil. But good and evil are too big, too philosophical, those words. Anyway, so I began to think about this. The opening sentence of Edith Wharton's novel, The Age of Innocence, offers the reader a great temptation. It reads, this is the opening sentence, on a January evening of the early 70s, this is the 1870s, Christine Nielsen, who is a real singer, was singing in Faust in the Academy of Music in New York, which was before the Metropolitan Opera House. The Academy of Music was there. So suddenly she has invoked Faust in her opening sentence and invoked Gounod's Faust. This opening scene of the novel, a work begun immediately after the First World War, will dramatize the cream of old New York society witnessing a performance of her work, which will deal, however lightly and sonorously, as Gounod does, with a pact with the devil, with a world in which the devil is present and temptation is close to, in which those in need of knowledge will fall into the clutches of someone, well, we know the story, Faust, who will offer them earthly powers and joys in exchange for the loss of their soul. And this loss in turn will lead to eternal damnation. What is soon clear, however, is that this is merely a shadowy sort of temptation, that Edith Wharton has no interest at all in the devil or the soul, that the opera, Gounod's Faust, has been named not as a sign for us to attend to the place of the Faustian bargain in the pattern of the novel, but rather because the opera, in all its strange un-Faustian brightness and sweet music, was in fact one of the favorites in the New York music world of that time, an age of innocence, as Wharton would have it. It was, for example, the opening opera of the new Metropolitan Opera House in New York in 1883, and one of the most performed operas there in the 20th century. In the opening pages of the book, Newland Archer, who's the protagonist of The Age of Innocence, he arrives in his box in the opera that evening just as the curtain had just gone up on the garden scene. He knew that it was, quote, not the thing to arrive early at the opera. The moment he begins to watch the opera has no sense of a dark bargain or a drama around the eternal life or earthly knowledge. It is a moment when the singer is sprinkling daisy petals with notes as clear as dew and singing, he loves me not. As Archer begins to look around at who is in the other boxes, the author, Edith Wharton, notes in parentheses, the boxes always stopped talking during the Daisy song, suggesting that they talked throughout the opera, that it was a social thing. The singers were merely singing in the background, and the music is being used in the novel, in fact, deliberately, as backdrop rather than foreground. The characters in the novel that are in the audience are being shown to us in all their narrowness and philistinism by the way they do not respond to the music, rather than by the way in which they allow the music to fill their spirit. Newland Archer, who's a young lawyer from a rich family, he also catches sight of the young woman whom he is to marry. She's at the opera, and in that moment, perhaps one of the ways in which music can be used in fiction comes to the fore. As he is watching May Welland, she is forced to be still. He can see her face in repose, her absorbed young face, as Edith Wharton wrote. He can try to read her more intensely by just looking at her as she listens than he could in a social setting or in a conversation. He can feel, quote, a tender reverence for her abysmal purity. She does not even guess, he feels, the implications of the scene she is watching or the opera she is attending. And it occurs to him then that he and she can read Faust together by the Italian lakes, as though that's going to make them happy once they're married. Wharton lets him have this thought, but then adds her own wry comment on it, writing that Newland Archer was, quote, somewhat hazily confusing the scene of his projected honeymoon with the masterpieces of literature, which it would be his manly privilege to reveal to his bride. Edith Wharton ends the paragraph by letting Newland picture his bride in some scene of old European witchery. As Newland Archer becomes entangled emotionally, which is the story of the novel, not with his wife, but with her cousin Ellen, the Countess Olenska, the question of Europe and of witchery arise, but they do so in the entirely secular space of an old New York obsessed by status and money and manners and class, a New York which Newland Archer both belongs to and tries to live at a distance from. Although Newland Archer, he reads books in the quietness of his study in the evening, his study is a secular space, as is the house, as his dreams and ambitions are secular, as the world around him is concerned with material things. There's no chance of the devil arriving in his study in the middle of the night. And this is the space in which the novel form itself, in general, is at its most content. Money and status are handed from one generation to the next. Society is stable. Young people want to be married. The novel can offer temptation to the young people, but it will be mild temptation. The temptation, for example, to flirt with the possibility of running away with a married woman, or the temptation to receive or not receive outsiders, or people who have broken the rules into the society. And then all will come right again. Bright order will be restored. The novel, which begins with a reference to Faust, will proceed according to the terms of a much more innocent bargain. Large questions will be replaced by glancing ones. The devil will not stalk the streets of Manhattan looking for souls. The novel form is good with bodies, appetites, earthly needs. It handles the soul only by implication. Soul is a difficult word to use in a novel. Edith Wharton's Age of Innocence resists the power of the music and the theme of the opera suggested in the opening scene. As with many other novelists, she wishes to keep her fictional space pure for the things of this world. Divine intervention will not be part of her fiction. The soul can look after itself. Music is for background, to be ignored. The opera is performed so the characters in the novel can be silent and watch each other. Whatever lives in their spirit as they watch is left out, replaced by what is carnal, temporal, limited, unprepared for the possibility of transcendence that the voice of the singer or the notes of the music may offer. Music, and indeed religion, as we know, come from an unearthly place. They're alien to the novel and the novelists. Novelists allow religion and music to roam in the novel's unheavenly spaces, only under the most unlimited circumstances, and usually not at all. But those limited circumstances, because they allow us a glimpse of the characters' souls as much as their earthly appetites and needs and dramas, or the merchandise that fills their houses, these can be very powerful ones. When novelists move out of the confined, circumscribed space of their circular universe towards the ineffable, the unearthly, the magical, the spiritual, then the novel itself, or even the short story, can have a strange and powerful aura, as though some new truth is being explored. It is as though the dour stability of prose had merged with the sweet symbols of musical notation to allow us a glimpse of a world beyond the confines of the known world. Because prose in narrative, unlike poetry, does not aspire to the condition of music, it aspires a great amount of the time to a condition of information, thus allowing references to music. Then allowing references to music into the narrative has a special power